Okay, take it, Steve.
All right. Well, hello all. Welcome to our December edition to Fireside Chat. We are the lake today finally is freezing at Lake Minnetonka. Otherwise, it could be dockside, but now we're finally now at the moment where warmth is appreciated. I'm Steve Parenti and joined with my co-host for these Millie Val Lab chats, Tom Gunderson, and just a little review of our traditions here. So this is a hour long. The first half hour is recorded for posterity that you can get to later, and that is effectively on the record. And then the second half hour is off the record for questions to come in to see how things turn out. So we are thrilled to welcome here Mike Berman, who just has an incredible career and all the things he's done from Boston SciMed, Boston Scientific, and all the ventures beyond. I'm going to turn it over to Tom to do the real introduction, and then let Mike tell us how the world really is. So,
Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for that, Steve. We're very pleased to have Mike Berman here. I would say a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him an introduction. That would. We were just chatting ahead of time. Both Mike and I have the same first memory of when we heard of each other. I was a product manager at a urology company in Minneapolis called AMS. He was a product manager at a then relatively unknown cardiology company called SciMed Life Systems. He called and was interested in building his team and wanted to know if I would interview for the job. I thought, lateral move, what's the big deal? Not what I'm looking for. Mike will tell you the lesson learned from that. I learned it the hard way. He tells his students now a lesson similar to what I had to learn. But from SciMed basically was the innovator that took angioplasty to the next level, and with that opened up cardiology to all sorts of innovation, new products, was eventually purchased by Boston Scientific. And Mike stayed with the company for a while after its acquisition by Boston Scientific. But then he and I sort of lost track of each other. I moved on to Piper Jaffray, and what we're looking for here is, Mike, maybe a quick catch up of post Boston Scientific.
Sure.
And then we'll spend some time talking about what's next.
Sure. So I was joined SciMed right out of business school in 1986, and was kind of in charge of marketing the whole way through until we were acquired by Boston Scientific. And then I was promoted to be the president of the cardiology business of Boston Scientific, which I ran for 5 years from 1995 until 2000. And then after leaving Boston Scientific, I really had no plan. It all happened very suddenly. I was offered to move to Boston, decided to decline that, and within 2 days was unemployed. And took quite a bit of time to think through what I really wanted to do next. And after about a year of poking around and interviewing and testing different things and getting involved with a couple of boards of startup companies and co-founding a company, I concluded that being involved with early stage startup innovators was really what I enjoyed doing. And that's what I wanted to do. And that's essentially what I've been doing for the last 23 years. So I've co-founded 8 companies over the years, and then I have invested in and joined the boards of, I have to count it up, but another 20 plus companies over the years, maybe 30 companies. And have been an active board member with all those, and an investor in all of them. A number of them have been quite successful. Quite a number have been total failures. So you get the full mix, and I can tell you about successes and failures, and I've learned from all of them. And then just to make life even a little more interesting, back before I was in business school, I lived in Israel for 5 years. And about a dozen years ago, my wife and I decided to move back to Israel. So we moved from Minneapolis to Tel Aviv. And I've been based in Tel Aviv for the last 11 years. And I've slowly shifted my portfolio from being US centric to being Israel centric. But it's essentially the same thing that I do in Israel as I did in the US, which is I invest in and I'm an active board member with a bunch of early stage companies. Most are pre-revenue, not all, but most are pre-revenue. If you pick well and you help out and you get a little bit of luck working in your favor, it can work out to be quite lucrative, and it certainly is fun.
Thanks. And then the move to Israel and moving your portfolio to Israel and a focus on Israeli, is it a focus on Israeli companies or just?
Yeah.
Okay.
Look, yeah, I mean, my local companies now are Israeli companies. And fortunately, Israel's got a very rich ecosystem of a lot of really innovative, interesting companies.
There's a sense here among us still stuck in the tundra of Minnesota that the Israeli medtech ecosystem moves faster and that there might be, if not more innovation, then more directed innovation in Israel. Is that true, or is that just myth?
No, I think it's generally true. I mean, Minneapolis is a very rich ecosystem as well. I mean, it's one of the top places in the world for developing medical devices. The Israel ecosystem is what I would call unbalanced. We don't have any large cap companies here. We have very few mid cap companies. It's basically a sea of startups, which is great, but it doesn't give. It's a different ecosystem to work in. As a result of a lot of things, Israeli startups tend to be more ambitious. You know, they try to tackle bigger problems. They tend to be more resource efficient. So, you know, $1 million goes a lot further in Israel than it does in the United States. The management teams here tend to be very naive when it comes to the challenges of sales and marketing, the challenges of M&A. Their kind of quick view is, hey, I invented something great, I'm done. You know, what else is there left to do once you've invented something really good? Turns out there's a lot to do. But it's a really, I mean, our decision to move back to Israel was not professionally driven. It could have been professionally inhibited, but because my wife is a professor of biology and got a number of good offers here, and because I knew there was a good ecosystem in Israel, we both were able to adapt very quickly and have enjoyed it immensely. But I think you're right, Tom, that the speed and the intensity in Israel is at a very, very high level. There tends to be a lot of corners cut that have to get fixed later. Part of that is just the kind of the sloppiness of the Israeli approach to things. You know, when you go down the street, there's more litter in the streets than there is in Minneapolis, and there's more documents that don't get written accurately in the design files than you'd find in the United States.
And so not only faster, but less paperwork. I like it. The lack of mid and large cap harkens back. This is a largely Minnesota-based audience that we have here, or linked audience, I should say. And, you know, Minneapolis, as you know, started off with no small or no medium or large cap. They grew into that, and a lot of that from M&A. Is there a sense of, you're an investor, and the innovation side is the same, the investment side you've talked about. What about exits?
You know, the Israel startup scene, I mean, most of the entrepreneurs are interested in exiting at some, you know, natural point in time, you know, when they've got pivotal data, or when they've got initial proof of concept in the field, or, you know, whatever it may be. And that is no different here than I think anywhere. You know, when I think back to 1986, when I joined SciMed, and for the next decade, there was a lot of, you know, startup companies that basically wanted to take it all the way. You know, why would you sell? Let's keep building. Let's build something really, really big. And that, I think, you know, really went away many years ago. And, when you run into a entrepreneur who says, oh, I want to, build it and take it all the way and have this be, a 50-year project, most of us kind of shrug our shoulders and think, oh, where did that alien land from? So Israel, I think, is not any different than the US in that there's an understanding that if you have a high quality startup, you likely will be acquired. If you have a low quality startup, you'll likely fail. And if you're in the middle there, maybe you'll have to take it a little bit further until you get acquired in order to prove to the acquirers that you've got something. And occasionally there will be something that'll go, much, much further. But if you think about the whole landscape, I mean, how many large cap companies have gone from start to large cap in the last 20, 30 years? I mean, Intuitive Surgical, Dexcom maybe. Who else can you think of that, has really gone from startup to, $50 billion market cap? Not very many.
Not very many. And well, we could talk about that just for the rest of the hour, but I'll skip that for now. Interesting thought. What I want to do is, the visions of the future from a serial entrepreneur kind of thing is that it seems to me, if we look back in history from the angioplasty to the other investments that you've made, the innovation that's been there in Medtech and other, I'm wondering what your thoughts are as we sit here in December of 2023 and you look out for those 3, 5, 10-year kind of investments of what's next. Because as you and I both know, the successes have come, those big successes that get acquired and those little successes that don't get acquired come from something often unique. And I'm wondering what you see as the next steps for medtech or healthcare in general.
Well, there's a huge number of there has been I mean, if you look at kind of the big arc, forget about the yearly ups and downs. There's a lot more venture capital going into startups now than there was 30 years ago or 20 years ago. I know that pretty much every CEO of a startup company complains about the fact that it's so hard to raise money, and it is. It really is hard, and especially in the last year and a half, as interest rates have gone up, it's become a much more difficult funding environment. But if you look at the big picture, there's a lot more money out there now than there was, 20, 30 years ago. But there's also a lot more efforts underway. And I forgot to mention, by the way, that in addition to the 10 or 11 companies that I'm on the boards of, I also spend a day a week as a venture partner with RiverVest Ventures in St. Louis. It's a group that I've known since they invested in Velocimed, which was a company that I co-founded in 2000. And so I see the RiverVest deal flow. I see my own deal flow in the US and in Israel, and I literally see hundreds of companies a year. And there are, I mean, you name the medical problem, and there is a startup out there that's trying to solve the problem. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about bladder cancer or Alzheimer's. There's companies out there that have interesting ideas about how to solve the problem. My observation is that one of the most important and maybe underappreciated things in the startup world is the issue of timing. You can be ahead of time. You can have a great idea, but be too early, and the market won't be ready. The investors won't be ready. It'll take too much time and too much money to get to the finish line, and you will fail because you started the race too early, not because your idea is flawed. And you can be too late where somebody else already has the success and you say, hey, let's do a better version of that. And by the time you get to market, there's 15 competitors and nobody can tell which one is the preferred one. And you just kind of get lost in the crowd. And despite the fact that maybe you did come up with an incrementally important invention, you're just not going to get above the noise and you won't be successful. And picking the right timing is a real critical part of the equation, in my view. It's I don't want to say it's as important, but it's certainly important, like picking the right market and having a good technological solution and putting together the right team and getting the right investors. having the right timing is really critically important. I can give you examples of companies that I personally have been involved with where we were either too early or too late or on time. And the difference of a couple of years can make the difference between success and failure.
Steve, I'll hand it over to you and maybe we can get a different view of what Mike's doing from you.
Yeah, but true. But Mike, you just set that up perfectly. Now I want those examples. But
okay.
but while you're doing them, I'm going to plant a little seed for you. So just, you know, my background, I'm a health economist. I'm the bad person that whispers to CMS saying pay for this or don't pay for this and everything else like that. These people would think of health economists that way. I guess one of the overarching questions, and we could talk about this a little bit after too, off the record, is to what extent is there a concern in the entrepreneur space that like 75% of this market is publicly financed through taxation? The whole healthcare market. Because this is where I always find the biggest disconnect. On the one hand, like what you're doing is like incredible. But there's the entrepreneur, the drive, all the other components of it. But there aren't many industries, save maybe aerospace, where you're dependent upon bureaucrats with taxation to kind of put that together. Does that ever come up as a concern? I know this is an outside issue, and I want you to go talk about your fabulous illustrations, but it's one that very rarely do we ever get to talk to just a raw entrepreneur with success.
Yeah.
And put that question out.
That is absolutely front and center for just about every startup company, but they don't think about it using the terms that you're using. They don't think about it in terms of, you know, taxes, paying for what we're doing. They think of it in terms of third-party reimbursement. And will I be able to prove what I need to prove in order to get the economic decision makers at the private healthcare insurance companies and Medicare to say this is reasonable and necessary to deploy into the healthcare system. I don't think I've ever encountered an entrepreneur who sits there thinking, oh, we're dependent upon the taxes of the country to be successful. You know, they're kind of 3 steps removed and they've abstracted it from taxes to the term reimbursement. But of course, you are absolutely correct that the big part of the healthcare expenditures in the United States and certainly in Europe and Japan is basically public money. And therefore, you've got a very complicated and involved decision-making process to figure out what gets paid for and what doesn't get paid for.
Yeah. So now I want to ask you, pivot back. Tell us some of those illustrations.
Examples. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I'll give you one of the first companies I got involved with after Boston Scientific was a local Minneapolis company called MyoCore. MyoCore was started in 1996, 7, something like that. I joined the board in 2000. And MyoCore developed a device for treating mitral valve regurgitation and heart failure. And had some good investors in the company and had some good clinical data. Essentially, because it was such a revolutionary device, when we were in the midst of our pivotal trial, we ran out of funds before we could get to the end of the pivotal trial. We were within striking distance of the end of the pivotal trial, but the investors were getting a little tired and didn't look like, and we were already, I guess the company was like 8 years into it, and it didn't look like the acquirers were getting ready to start acquiring anything yet. And we basically ended up, getting to the end of the runway and not being able to get the company financed to complete the pivotal trial, and ended up selling the IP to Edwards for, maybe 5 cents on the dollar or whatever, whatever we ended up with. And if I look at that same space of mitral valve regurgitation, fast forward about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years later, there were 4 companies that were acquired for $300, $400, $500 million each that had much less clinical data than MyoCore had at the time that we went bust. They each had 10, 20 patients that they treated in early stage trials. And the market dynamics were such that all the big players looked at the aortic field that Edwards and Medtronic had come to dominate for less invasive implantation of heart valves through the leg as opposed to opening up the chest. And they said, oh boy, mitral is going to be the next frontier. And if we want to be the winner in mitral, we got to be number 1 or number 2. We can't be number 3, 4, or 5 because their experience in the aortic space is that if you were number 3, 4, or 5, you basically failed. You know, you weren't going to get anywhere. And so there's this land rush for Abbott, Boston, Medtronic, St. Jude to buy properties or companies in the mitral space. And so the top 4 mitral companies with very little clinical experience all got acquired for big, big, big numbers. And I'm pretty sure that if MyoCore had been there at the same stage or further along, probably would have gotten acquired. But because we were a good half a dozen years or more earlier, it was just too unsettled, too unknown. Nobody was ready to commit. Investors didn't quite see it the way they saw it later. So in the case of MyoCore, really good technology, outstanding team, good investors, but we just were ahead of our time by too much. But by too much. Let me give an example of good timing. I've got a couple of examples. One would be Lutonix. I was an investor and an early board member with Lutonix. I was not a founder of the company. Li Zhao Wang and Dennis War were the founders of the company, but I got involved very, very early on. And there were already a number of other, I mean, Lutonix got founded after there was a journal article in the New England Journal of Medicine about a European drug-eluting balloon catheter project that had done enough clinical work to publish an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. So think about that. You know, here you're starting a company and this other project is far enough along that they're already publishing stuff in the New England Journal of Medicine. That's a 5-year gap. That's a big gap. But we looked around and said, you know what, we think we can execute better and faster and with a preferred technology, and we think we can compete. And in fact, Lutonix ended up beating this European project to market and ended up being one of the first 2 drug-coated balloon catheters to develop and develop really good clinical data. And we ended up selling the company to C.R. Bard, which is now Becton Dickinson. The other leading company got acquired by Medtronic. And this was an example of if we had started 5 years earlier, I'm not sure we would have been successful. If we'd started 5 years later or 2 years later, we probably would have missed that window. And of course, when you're in the midst of this, in the moment, you don't really know what the right timing is. You're trying to assess it, but you don't really know. But looking back through my retrospectoscope, which has 20/20 vision, I can tell you that Lutonix had very, very good, in addition to having a great team and great technology and great investors and all the rest, it had really good timing on developing that and being successful. And that had a big impact on our ability to have a very good financial return for investors and employees. Now I got to think about something that's too late. Well, I said MyoCore too early, Lutonix on time. Too late. I'll have to think about that. I don't want to insult anybody.
You did, even though you're in Israel, you spent a lot of time in Minnesota to develop that sort of instinct to not call out the bad one.
Right.
But it's super helpful to know. So, I mean, one of the things that's exciting that we're doing with this Val Lab that's sponsoring this is we actually are working with as many early stage medtech firms as possible, mostly just kind of to your point about the Israeli sort of ecosystem, like, you know, it sounds like, you know, we got an idea, where do we go? We're trying to sort of school folks to kind of think about all the factors that need to come into play. Though timing isn't always one of them. Usually it's just like, is your IP okay? Is your regulatory okay? Do you have a path for reimbursement? I guess one of the questions back to timing again, is there any way to get a sense as to whether timing, whether you can predict the timing is there, or is it just the luck of the draw when something shows up on your doorstep?
Well, no, I think that, you know, this is an example, I think, of where experience can give
Mm.
wisdom, can be very, very helpful. Generally, the entrepreneur, the founder, is the last person to ask whether the timing is right. They're just in love with their project, and they just, they just can't see straight. They're just focused on all the greatness of what they're doing, and that's what you need in an entrepreneur. You don't want a balanced, thoughtful, introspective entrepreneur. You want somebody who's going to go for it. But this is where investors actually, I think, have a big, big impact, because investors are thinking about this kind of stuff. And if they look at something and say, oh, this is too early, or oh, this is too late, there's already too much competition, it really has an impact. Let me give you a real life example of something that might be a little late right now. If you look at the field of thrombectomy in the brain for stroke patients, it's gone through multiple phases. There were a number of projects 20 years ago of companies that developed devices for removing blood clots from the brain during an acute stroke, with the idea of trying to reduce the severity of the stroke. And the first series of clinical trials that these companies did all turned out to be negative. And the whole field went through. So these were companies that were too early, or they hadn't perfected the technology, or they didn't do the right clinical trials, or the operators weren't good enough yet, or whatever it might have been. But there were like 3 clinical trials that showed that these things don't improve outcomes. And the whole field just kind of went into, maybe not quite hibernation, but there was not a lot of money available for these companies. There were a couple of companies that continued to bang away at it, and they did additional clinical trials, and they, to their credit, and they got rewarded for it, they modified their devices, they modified the clinical trials, and then within the space of a year, there were 2 or 3 clinical trials that showed, if you use this device in this way, in this protocol, you actually can be successful, and you can reduce the severity of strokes by removing clots from the brain. And these companies, like Penumbra and others, really benefited from, financially, from the innovations that they drove forward. The minute they were successful, that then drew in a whole bunch of capital and inventors to try to come up with better ways of taking blood clots out. Little nets and different kinds of suction mechanisms and different kinds of energy sources, and you name it. And there were a number of additional ones that have become successful. But now you look out in that market, and it's really hard to pick who the next winner is going to be, because there must be 30 companies out there, each of whom have developed their next version of the better mousetrap for taking blood clots out of the brain. And I'm sure some of those, 1, 2, 3 of those, will be successful, but it's really, really hard when you've got a noisy field with 30 competitors to figure out which one is going to be the one that really moves the field forward and will be successful commercially. How much of those improvements will be worthy enough to really shift market share, as opposed to worthy enough just to get FDA approval and then kind of languish because you're, 17th in a field of 50. And, only number 1, 2, or 3 generally, have reasonable businesses. So that's an example. I'm not involved, by the way, in any of these companies right now, but that's an example of the evolution of a field, and making sure that you try to, not just pick the right technology and the right team, but also the right timing. And I don't know how I got latched onto timing. I don't mean to say it's the most important thing. It's just, I think it's an issue that's underappreciated.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, because I mean, in the different spaces I'm operating, even the stuff that in the health insurance space, there is actually innovation that occurs. And like health savings accounts now are a way of life, for example, and as a way for investment vehicles, let alone just different ways for insurance to be offered. It was around as an idea for about 10 years before it ever took off, and the timing was never right for it to happen. And when the timing did happen, it exploded. Same idea. We are at the end of nearly at the end of our half hour, and we see questions that are emerging in the chat, which is great. So just a call out to all those folks that are here. If you have a question, there's 2 ways to do it. Put it into the chat, and then Mike and Tom and I either read it, or basically just put your hand up, and then call on you to get your questions in and converse. So, and Tom, we're nearly at 1.4 million right now. So just one
inside
just
joke.
one away. So exactly. Sorry. So let's go off the record officially.